Hello everyone, my name is Luke Sloan. I'm a professor at the School of Social Sciences at Cardiff University, and I've been researching social media for probably over a decade now, since it really came to the fore as a vein of opportunity for social science research. So I'm going to speak a little bit today about practical tips and things to think about when doing social media research, specifically in relation to ethics. Now, I will say that there are lots of questions and very few answers, and I've been told I have a tight 15 minutes that I'll do my best to keep to. So please treat this as a primer, introducing you to some of the key issues you want to think about, some of the things about social media data that's different to some of the more traditional sources, why social media data is disruptive, and basically the right questions to ask yourself to help you navigate through what is sometimes quite a complicated ethical maze. Right, so ethical research using social media. There are no new dilemmas. There's a new context, there's new data types, although social media data shares a lot of similarities in some ways to transactional data and other data that exists, is created outside of the parameters of specific research projects, but the fundamental ethical principles remain the same. So we're still concerned with informed consent. And what does that mean on social media? If the data has been generated outside of a research project, if you haven't had a chance to explain your project to someone to get them to tick all those boxes to say they understand what they're getting into and what they're given the data for, to what extent can consent be informed? There's lots of interesting questions here, and we'll keep coming back to this throughout the presentation about the nature of the platform, the public or not nature of the data, and the reasonable expectations of someone using social media to talk about anything in their life. And perhaps actually that's the biggest issue with social media data, and it does come back to the second point there about avoidance of harm. People can talk about anything. We have no control. We don't have a survey instrument or an interview guide or a schedule or even themes to help steer us towards what sort of things people might choose to disclose. Of course, there's other research methods that do this, observational studies, ethnographic studies. We see lots of things, and we don't control what people do. In the sense, the data is naturally occurring, albeit the notion of what is natural and what isn't can be contested. But we do act as filters in that situation with what we choose to interpret and what we choose to record and what we don't. And with social media, we have to really think about what people are saying and our role as a researcher in resurfacing perhaps unsavory or unpopular things that they said. And if I were to publish something in a paper about something I saw online, would that therefore expose the data creator, the participant, in a very passive sense of a participant? Would it expose them to additional harm? So if they said something 10 years ago that would now be considered not very sensitive or political, and I've resurfaced that and re-exposed them, I've actually arguably increased the level of harm to them. So that's something we're always balancing. Privacy is an interesting one, because the data exists independent of being collected. What are our responsibilities to honouring the privacy individual? What are the individual's expectations of privacy, depending on if they're using Twitter, X? I will say Twitter sometimes, just out of force of habit, I'm sorry, but I mean Twitter, X. So that's a very public forum, unless your posts are locked down. Your expectations as a participant in that might be very different to a private group on WhatsApp, or even a public post on X, Twitter is very different to a direct message. So in addition to us having to understand the context in which these things are made, we need to try and understand when the data was created, what were the expectations the individual had. The other point about deception, it does apply to social media research. So projects, for example, that may be interested in a more experimental method like creating an intervention to see how people react, there's an element of deception in that. Deception, I think, also comes in in two other ways in relation to trying to understand whether a participant is actually a real person or not, or a bot. So we as researchers might be deceived as to whether we're collecting data from a real person or not. I think it also relates to people's understanding of how their data is used. We'll talk a little bit about terms of service, and if people understand when they put something on a platform that it can therefore be passed on to a third party. I don't think it's deception in the sense that anyone is trying to hide anything, but those terms of services can be very hard for people to read, and we know that many people don't read them, and even those who do read them typically don't always understand the implications. So there's an issue maybe not about deception, but about clarity of understanding of what we're doing when we engage with these platforms. And there's an interesting question as to whether the burden of that therefore lays on the person creating the data or on us as researchers, or whether it's shared. So yes, as I've already intimated, the context has shifted even though the questions are the same. It's worth thinking about these, going back to Halford's 5 disruptions, 2018, still just as pertinent today. Social media has become so integral, really, and the way we communicate has changed so fundamentally. It's hard to remember what it was like at the advent and when it first started. But if we think back to why this was disruptive, to the new ways of communicating, new ways of doing research using this data, it really helps us understand why we struggle with it. These characteristics, these 5 things, are often characteristics of other types of data as well, such as like data already created. Well, there's financial data, transactional data, anything like that already created, not necessarily for the purposes of research. But I think what characterizes social media data is that all 5 of these things apply. So let's go through them very quickly. So data already created, of course, means that we as researchers are not eliciting the data. We instead have a role of finding the signal in the noise. So millions, billions of data points, and our job is to find the ones that are appropriate. And what that means is that 99.9% of the stuff we get, particularly if we're working with Twitter or X data, is often irrelevant. So we don't curate it. It's similar, I guess, to anyone using any secondary or publicly available data, but there's something very specific about social media data where it can be any thought, opinion, attitude, or behavior. The variety of it, which we'll come on to later, is a particular challenge. Point 2, we don't control the data. We don't collect the data in the way we would more traditional methods, and we control it and we lock it down, we keep it safe. So who does control it? And this is interesting in relation to things like right to withdraw. So participants often have the right to withdraw, and you might stage that right to withdraw at different times. So you might say someone can withdraw up to a certain point after they submitted a survey return. You might say it's later on in the process or at any point. If you're collecting an anonymous survey, and if it's truly anonymous, you might point out that the right to withdraw doesn't exist after the survey's been submitted because you wouldn't have any way of identifying the individual respondent in the dataset. Social media is interesting because it's out there, it's public, and at any given time, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of users are collecting this data for market research. So if you were to create a post on Twitter or Facebook and then delete it, you might consider that to have been removed, but it's always been collected by actors all over the globe. So, what control do you actually have over it once it's created and put in the public domain? As a creator, very little. What's our role in negotiating, managing those control methods of researchers? It's not always very clear. And that leads on to point 3, which is the lack of permanency. So I would be thinking about the fact that you can post something and then you can edit it. And, as a researcher, which version of that post did I get and which one do I honour? And if you want to remove something, what happens? The other thing, of course, is that things often exist within context in social media. So you get an isolated tweet or post on X Twitter, but that's been part of a multi-layer conversation involving hundreds of actors and thousands of posts. It's part of a conversation. So I've got this one isolated thing that doesn't sit within context, and that can make it very difficult as well. Because it exists within an emergent and constantly shifting narrative of a conversation. Volume and granularity is interesting. So the sheer rate at which this data is given, the granularity of it at the individual level creates a challenge. If you're collecting millions of data points, what does it even mean to talk about a participant as opposed to a data creator? Are they participants in the traditional sense? Should they be characterized as such? And the final point is that data can be used by everyone. So what that means is that when we talk about using data and we have conversations with individuals, we do find some of the previous research I've been involved in and colleagues have done suggests that individual data creators do differentiate between, say, government, academia, and private organizations, and their willingness to share their data and their perception of trust. But the problem is it's quite hard sometimes to explain that and defend it. So if there's a data misuse case or a bad news story from a particular platform, everyone's going to be affected by that, from academic researchers who are following very tight IRB requirements and institutional requirements, through to someone who isn't following any rules, just collecting the data for whatever purpose. So it's disruptive in those ways. The other complication is that not all social media is equal. So it's incredibly heterogeneous. We talk about social media because it's a convenient way to group lots of different things, but of course that's everything from a closed chat on WhatsApp through to an open post on Twitter X, things like 4chan, Reddit, Facebook. Like, it's all social media and it's all different. Even the technically the below the line comments on YouTube would count as social media. So there are a few things you have to consider, because this heterogeneity means that every use case relating to a platform has different considerations. So is the platform open or closed? Does the participant have a reasonable expectation that this data will remain within the community or that it will be broadcast more publicly? Variety of data provides a particular challenge as well. So a post on X, Twitter, could be text, emojis, hashtags, video, audio, images, fixed images. And as I pointed out before, it could be part of a long trail of a conversation. So, when you get to tweet, you get all manner of information about it as well. And because it's so flexible, you have to really think about what you're capturing. So a tweet on its own, a retweet, is different to an authored tweet. Sorry, I know I should just read posts or whatever they call them on X now when I say tweets. But an original content, which may or may not reflect what an individual thinks, is very different to a retweet, which might be read in a way to endorse a position, or it might be done ironically or sarcastically. So, what even is this data? It's so varied and intentions are so different. It'd be very hard to know what we're dealing with. Differential privacy expectations, I talked about that. Really, I touched on it in that first point there. What are the reasonable expectations of an individual compared to an open post or a private message? And do individuals understand that? It's quite patronizing, I do think, to say that individuals don't understand what they're doing. And a lot of research would suggest that teenagers in particular, although I don't by any means abide by the digital native thing, they do carefully curate their online profiles. But there's also another sort of area of research which suggests that when people are talking on social media, even in public broadcast mediums, they're thinking about their immediate circle that are going to receive that information, not the fact that someone on the other side of the world might be interested in it. So there's the expectations of privacy, and then to what extent people understand the consequences of what they're doing online and where it might end up. We've also got the issue of identifiability. So Facebook, very much linked to individuals, Reddit, very anonymous, and other platforms in between. You might create a pseudonym to hide yourself, but there's a lot of metadata available on social media, and not so much now, but in a previous, maybe 7 years ago, there's a lot of geotag tweets as well. So someone might have a pseudonym, be tweeting about something, but if they got geotag switched on, they might be sat in their home doing it, and that data would be publicly available to find them. So there are elements of the scalability and traceability which raise questions around anonymity and whether things can be traced back to individuals. There's the issue of whether we're dealing with non-humans and bots and trying to work out whether bot farms are amplifying particular views and to what extent we're actually getting a realistic picture of what people are doing and saying. And then there's the terms of service, which differ between platforms, and even on platforms they can change overnight. And how do we keep on top of that as researchers, but also how aware are participants that terms of service may or may not change? And yes, absolutely, they are notified when it happens, but do they read it? Do they understand it? And to what extent does that matter? And is that a concern for us? So what's the answer? There are no answers, only more questions. It's not entirely true. But I do think it's really helpful to go back to what ethics is about. Ethics is about asking questions and reflecting on practice, not about tick box exercise. It's about understanding shades of grey and doing the best by our participants or people who could potentially be within our study. I would highly recommend the Association of Internet Researchers, I would call it a worry question sheet, which talks about different data types and the questions you need to ask. So here's an example of a few I've represented here. So if you're thinking about consent, how well articulated in the terms of service is the idea that the data might be shared with third parties. If you're talking about harm, think about if you were to take that piece of data created out of the context or out of the environment in which it's created, are you exposing an individual to more harm by doing that? And how might you ameliorate that? Or does that actually make it not viable really for you to continue with that project? Also thinking about privacy. So does the author participant have a reasonable expectation of privacy based on the platform which they've done? Having a conversation on WhatsApp, you'd expect a privacy expectation to be higher than publicly broadcasting something on, Under the Line on YouTube or on X, Twitter. You might also say, of course, that at any point, WhatsApp is a good example, those privacy expectations could be easily derailed by a member of the in-group too. So again, we have to remember we're different. We're not members of the in-group, we're the researchers, so our responsibilities are different. A few additional considerations. I don't know if these are considered complexities, but there are different flavors of the way you might do research with social media that may make it easier or difficult to ask these ethical questions, or at least maybe to answer them. So when it comes to consent, for instance, I do work on linked data studies. So we collect survey data and then we ask to link to social media data. So there's an opportunity where you do get direct consent and you can explain to people what you're going to do and under what basis you're going to hold the data, who can access it, and so on and so forth. And importantly, the participant has the right to say no. Whereas if you're just collecting the data in the public sphere, they don't really have any right to say no once they've made it public. Or if they do, how do they even know that they need to say no to you specifically? How do they even know that you're using their data? Other ways of doing this include tracking studies, so browser plugins. And browser plugins are quite good because if someone's navigating social media, they may only collect a particular thing that you're interested in. So again, that's ethical in the sense that you're not collecting everything and then you've got 99% of this data that you're not interested in, but you have. You can focus on the things that you need, and it's more ethical to collect the data that you need only and nothing else. So that's an option. Obviously, to install a browser plugin requires someone to accept terms and conditions. You can have a conversation with them about what they're doing and their decision will be more informed. Similar actually is data donation. So we've got colleagues working on this. Most notably, I know some colleagues in GESIS in Germany that do work on this. And of course, if you're doing data donation, you're asking someone to request their data from a social media site and then to pass it on to you through some sort of secure link. And the very act of downloading your data, I don't know if you've ever done it, but I'd highly recommend it now. If you go and ask a company to provide you with a data download, you then see what that company knows about you, what the platform knows about you. Therefore, when you hand it over, you really do understand through your own lens, through your own interpretation, having seen your own data, what it is you are giving to a researcher. So I actually think that's a really ethical way of doing things. by making the participant active in the data transfer process. There's also arguments to say that you can give opt-in or opt-out consent. So that's a link there to a paper for, well, what was Twitter is now X, talking about the difference between public and private individuals, whether public individuals are acting in a public capacity, such as politicians, have a right to ask for their data not to be considered once it's in the public domain, once it's a matter of public record. Also, there's issues there about, are individuals vulnerable, which is very hard to tell often on social media sites, which are often demographic light. And there's questions there about whether it's a sensitive subject, and therefore, are you likely to put the spotlight on people by doing this? Or at risk of identifying them, would that increase their risk of harm? In which case you might want to ask them. One thing I would say about that is I do know researchers who have done work on, say, misogyny online, and they've messaged people to say, can I use your tweet in my research? And those people have said, yeah, sure. Because, you know, some people put it out there and they know what they're doing and they want their views to be shared. So opt-in consent is not always, and opt-out consent is not always as big a hurdle as you might think. Related to that, though, you really do need to seek advice and consider if you need to conduct a data protection impact assessment. If you're not gaining direct consent, that is a really important thing for you to consider. And I don't want to get tied down in the legal implications of it, but I would really recommend that you contact your research integrity team or your data protection team in your institution or organisation to seek advice on that before you proceed, if you're not directly asking people for consent. Thanks for listening, folks. Not quite 15 minutes, but I think we covered quite a lot there. I wish you the best of luck with your projects. The one thing I'll say in closing is that I do think we have a responsibility to find ethical ways of negotiating this data. So yes, it's hard. Yes, it's tricky, but I don't think we should throw it up in the air and give up. I think we can set good practice. We can set community standards. And through that, we can earn the trust of people to know that this data is important for understanding the social world and that we can treat it respectively and with the dignity it deserves. Thanks very much, everyone. Good luck with your projects.